to welcome all our participants and viewers, both online and offline. Before we proceed to the session of the day, for the sake of our first-time viewers and participants, I would like to provide a brief overview about the DAREECHA. The DAREECHA is a PPF forum to discuss and share views on various social issues and problems of interest with young scholars and activists. The PPF invites budding academicians, grassroots activists, researchers, journalists, and thought leaders to participate in this program. The initiative aims at promoting better understanding amongst the voices of diversity through deliberations and dialogue, and to encourage constructive exchange of views on selected themes and processes. Secondly, I would like to apprise everyone of the format of the session. We have a presentation by our esteemed speaker of the day, followed by a question and answer session. All the participants are requested to post their question and observation or any relevant point that they want to make in the chat box or the question and answer box, and we will take them up towards the end of the session. Now, moving on to the next, I would like to introduce our speaker of the day, Mr. Shivam Shankar Singh. Mr. Shivam Shankar Singh is a data analyst, campaign consultant, and author of the bestsellers like How to Win an Indian Election and The Art of Conjuring Alternate Realities, How Information Warfare Saves Your World. He started out in politics as a legislative assistant to a member of parliament, fellow, and went on to witness the process of conjuring political realities while managing data analytics for some of the largest political parties. He is a panelist on national television and writes for several news publications on data and politics. He graduated from the University of Michigan and Arbor with BSc in economics and was a 2021-22 Schwarzman Scholar at Tsinghua University, Beijing. The subject of today's discussion is decoding a basic information warfare framework. As we know, information warfare is a form of indirect warfare of modern times. It is also called a battle of narrative, wherein the information is weaponized. In our today's time, in the age of social media, dissemination of information takes a second and a click. It is popularly believed that in the contemporary times, whoever controls the flow of information controls the world. Now, to dive deep into the subject in detail, without going further, I would like to hand over the platform to our speaker. Over to you, sir.
Yep. Thank you so much, Prince. Thank you to the PPF team for organizing this discussion on such an important topic. I'll actually dive straight in and start sharing my screen so that we can directly head to the presentation. Let me know if my screen is visible. The screen sharing is fine, right?
Yes, sir. It is visible now.
Okay, perfect. So the topic, as we know, is decoding an information warfare framework. Before we delve into that, though, just a short introduction of how do I even know about this topic. So first, I worked in Indian politics and saw how political narratives are shaped, how data and social media and any tool to reach public is used to shape public opinion. Since then, I've also directly worked with studying information warfare, especially related to China and US relations, and also in the domestic circumstances of India. And that's what got me excited about the topic. But very soon I realized that information warfare is not new, and it's not new at all. A lot of us here would know the story of Ashwatthama during the Mahabharata war, where a fake narrative was spread about Ashwatthama being killed, except it was not the warrior and the elephant. If we look at a book like Sun Tzu, that's from 200 to 500 years ago, the book says all warfare is based on deception. Sorry, my screen's having some. Yeah, all warfare is based on deceptions. Hence, yeah, hence once we are not attacking, we must seem unable. When we're using our forces, we must appear inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. These examples, plus if you look at something like ancient Greece, if you look at the writings of Chanakya, you look at the First World War, where the French used interception and deception techniques on radio frequencies for the first time. Or when you look at all actors of World War II, be it America, England, the Allied forces, or the Axis forces of Japan. A very interesting example, by the way, Japan used information warfare in India and had a lot of pamphlets in regional languages, especially Bengali and Hindi, talking about how you're not Indian if you don't condemn the Jallianwala Bagh incident. And it was essentially to generate an anti-British sentiment while Japan was fighting against Britain in the Asian theater of the Second World War. So these examples, and a lot of them, not new at all. But what we have now is that anything can be termed information warfare. FIMI is a very new term for foreign influence and manipulation. Especially when foreign entities are involved, the term gets very tricky. Foreign influence and domestic influence are both actually extremely legitimate aspects of international relations, diplomacy, and politics. A nation trying to influence another nation's policies, be it by our Prime Minister Narendra Modi visiting the United States recently, or be it by politicians from the US giving statements about the human rights records of other countries. It's nothing new, and it's actually fairly legitimate parts of international relations. And when we look at cross-border engagement of companies, a lot of companies now, like Indian companies, operate in different countries around the world. If they try to influence the public opinion about themselves in those countries, it is not information warfare. It's a pretty legitimate means of influence. Foreign influence and manipulation, though, and domestic influence and manipulation, these new terms, FIMI and DIMI, are distinct. They're done with malicious intent and often through covert means. And it's the covert means and malicious intent that actually differentiates them from just normal influence. Just a sec, I have to fix. Yeah. Foreign influence and manipulation, often labeled as disinformation. This is the definition from EEAS, that's the European International Relations Body. It's essentially Europe's foreign services for the collective entity of the European Union as a whole. FIMI is a mostly non-illegal pattern of behavior that threatens potential and has potential for negative impact on values, procedures, and political processes. Such activity is manipulative in character, conducted in a coordinated manner. Actors of such activity can be state or non-state actors, including their proxies inside and outside of their own territory. So in this new definition, they also differentiated from normal behavior in the sense that it has to be a coordinated activity. It cannot be one or two separate instances of misinformation or disinformation. As we saw, information warfare itself is extremely old. From the age of Mahabharata, we have recorded history of disinformation, misinformation being used. But what is different now? The age of the internet and the age of information is what is new now. What does this do? One, it reduces the cost and increases the speed of information warfare. Second, there are more sources of information warfare now. Earlier, if you saw, there were like one TV channel, most of it was state controlled. It was very difficult to do, and you had to manually print pamphlets and distribute it during, say, the First World War or before. Before that, all you had was essentially rumor mongering, where you had people-to-people information transfer for information warfare. What's changed now is you have hundreds of TV channels, hundreds of pages of social media, so many YouTube channels. So you can basically form information silos. Now you're not trying to convince the entire community or the entire nation. You are trying to convince a small subset of people. The fourth one, which is very interesting, ideology and intent have been delinked. If you saw information warfare, even during the Cold War, there was a very clear ideology from the US, that was capitalism, and from the Soviet bloc, which was essentially communism. And the information warfare practices that they followed was to further this ideology. In the modern world, in the world we live in right now, furthering an ideology might not even be the purpose of information warfare. A lot of it is actually done just to get people to disengage from conversation altogether, make topics so toxic, make democratic interface between two sides so toxic that there is no reconciliation, there is no middle ground. So a lot of information warfare that we see now is just to disrupt streams of information instead of trying to convince you of something. When talking about the terms, this is sort of important because a lot of confusion exists around what terms mean. Misinformation is false information with no harm intended. And as we all know, just being wrong is not illegal. Neither is it wrong in and of itself. People can be wrong about facts. People can quote things which are inaccurate. And if it's false information with no harm intended, it's misinformation for sure, that should be debunked, but it's different from disinformation. Disinformation is false information with harm intended. This is a coordinated campaign, a coordinated attack, where an entity has decided that, okay, we have to spread this false information in different forms to different groups for a specific purpose. Then we have malinformation. Malinformation is actually true information. There is nothing wrong with the information. It's not a lie, but it's spread with harm intended. So it could be true facts about, say, a certain politician or a certain incident that's spread in a different light with a particular impact intended at the end of it. The patterns. Let's talk about how it's actually worked in the real world in the past. Leaking information, often through hacked data and hacked servers, is a very common form of information warfare in the modern age. A big one that we saw of leaking information, Australia's parliamentary IT systems were hacked. Australia has a body called the ASD, that concluded that the attack emanated from China and was an attempt to influence its 2019 elections. So this attack was actually hacking. Australian servers and servers of political parties and political candidates were hacked, from which information was obtained. The intent of the information was either to blackmail specific individuals or leak the information in a selective manner to influence the outcomes of the elections. Then, as we saw in the 2019 US elections, lots of allegations of Russia interfering in the US elections. The information warfare, the information part was separate, but there was also a part where servers of the emails of DNC, the Democratic Party's campaign committee, was hacked. So John Podesta, who headed Hillary Clinton's campaign committee, his emails were hacked and selectively leaked on WikiLeaks and then distributed to various media outlets. And the intent was clearly to harm Hillary Clinton's campaign and help Donald Trump's campaign to win. Why a state actor would do something like this is something that's extensively covered in the Mueller report. The report itself is undergoing discussions right now. Then we have something like hacker groups leaked photos from Defense Ministry during the Israeli elections in 2019. This hack got linked to Iran at the end of it, but this was a proven attempt. So all three topics that we've talked about now of cyber hacking and selectively leaking information is a component of information warfare. And this is the kind of attack that gets proven. The second type that's much harder to prove and much harder to link to a specific entity is flooding the information environment through social media or conventional media with messaging designed to produce an effect desired by the attacker. Usually what we've seen in attacks is that cyber and information attacks go together. And I personally believe that these should be studied together because attribution and identifying specific actions in cyber attacks is easier than doing so for information attacks. But because they go hand in hand, if you can trace back where leaked data came from and see how it was disseminated, you have a much likelier outcome of identifying the information warfare attack in its entirety. A word on collusion versus interest aligning. So we've all heard of the Brexit campaign where the United Kingdom left the European Union. There is significant evidence to suggest that Russia wanted Brexit very badly. because a weakened Europe with the United Kingdom out of it is obviously something that benefits Russia, especially if it was going to attack Ukraine as it did right now. And the UK is out of the European Union, so it's not a strong party to the invasion at this point of time. So that is something that they wanted. Boris Johnson also wanted it. An entire political side of the United Kingdom also wanted it, but there is no evidence of collusion. There is only evidence of interest aligning, and the evidence that Russia leaked, the narratives that Russia spread. There's a specific unit within Russia that actually used social media and internet communication methods to influence what people saw on their social media feeds. And a lot of the messages circulated by them were actually also supported and circulated by UK politicians locally. The difference is interest did not align. US 2016, there is some evidence of active collusion. The final report is yet to come out, but there is some evidence that Russia leaking evidence was also directly in touch with members of Donald Trump's campaign staff, was also in touch with a lot of media outlets and actively engaging a lot of personnel to spread misinformation. So that falls under collusion. These two are very different things. The second one happens less and less. The first one, though, happens more and more, where you see an adversarial power supporting an ideological side that is also supported by someone within the domestic political regime of a country. Let's delve into the framework itself. The reason I covered this short introduction before even talking about the framework is that it's important to understand the difference between misinformation and disinformation. It's important to understand collusive behavior versus non-collusive interests aligning. And it is important to understand that cyber security itself and data breaches are an integral component of information warfare. It's not just spreading messages on social media. Both of them happen together. So it's an all of society attack. But how does a narrative get built? Jumping into the framework, when we wrote our second book, The Art of Conjuring Alternate Realities, as Prince mentioned, we noticed that a content that can be debunked and a fake message, a fake WhatsApp forward, a fake image, a fake video, debunking it does not really help. And it does not really help because that is not how information warfare works. It's not based on one image. It's not based on one fake fact. It's not based on one piece of disinformation. It is an all of society attack designed for a specific objective. So the way it works is an entity usually comes up with an objective. What is the end goal that they want to accomplish? Then they decide on narratives. What are the different narratives that say spreading these narratives would help accomplish this objective? Then they place it within the current context. What would convince the audience to believe it? What is it in their personal lives? What is it that they hear in society? What is it that they see every day that will lead them to believe these negative narratives? That's when they design a campaign. A campaign is a set of content. It could be hundreds of pictures, hundreds of social media posts, hundreds of videos, and there is a release schedule on when they want like the impact to peak. When do they want the activity to be at its maximum in social media? When do they want it to dip a little so that other conversations can also come in, so that organic content can also come in? So that campaign gets designed, and that is when content design happens and individual pieces of content start getting released. Let's start with a basic example, defining objectives. What are you trying to achieve? What is the end goal? Say you want a particular government in a particular country to lose the elections, and you realize that the key for them to lose the election is the middle class not voting for them. So your objective is the middle class should not vote for this particular political party. After you have this objective stated, you move on to decide the narratives. What different narratives can you use? What is it that you lead people to believe that would convince them to not vote for a political party because they are middle class? One narrative could be something like price rise. Another narrative could be something like, say, unemployment. Another narrative, separate narrative could be something like papers and exams leaking. A fourth narrative could be something like, oh, the tax burden is very high. So you come up with all of these different narratives. I'm using this particular example just because it's less contentious. If you look at a religious example on the other extreme, you could want society to believe that Hindu khatre mein, like one particular religion is under threat. Then the narratives that you would use would be how the other religion is getting more benefits from the government, or how the other religion is being favored by some other political party, how criminals from that religion are not being persecuted. Or a fourth narrative could be how people from that community commit more crime than everyone else. So these could be different narratives that you design. Moving back to the non-contentious example of middle class and price rise, once you've decided the different narratives, then you set the context. You have to define what is it in people's lives that would lead them to believe any of these specific things. So if we talk about unemployment, what is the context? The data and the numbers are not enough. You have to understand how people are feeling because they're unemployed. They might not feel a sense of worth in society. They might not feel a sense of worth in their families. They might be disillusioned from, say, public activity altogether. So you build that context and you start using that to actually construct an attack. Once the context part is done, that is when you come to the campaign. If you keep pushing hundreds of messages from the first day onwards, it's going to be obvious that it's an information warfare attack. It's a campaign. So you can't do it that way. You cannot make it look like something that's happened suddenly in one day with hundreds of bot accounts and hundreds of people writing the exact same thing. So there is a design to it where you decide, oh, we are going to start with just this segment of society. We are going to spread just these 5 messages every day. Then we are going to move on to 15 messages and 20 messages. Similarly, you decide a campaign on these many pictures, these many videos, these many text messages, and you decide how you are going to spread out. So you start from a niche audience of, say, people on a few Facebook pages. Then you move on to influencers and celebrities. Then you try and move on to conventional media. What would you include in a campaign to get this message across? What will be the key points that you want to communicate is what goes behind campaign design. And the last thing is content. This is the specific things to include. This could be testimonials, historical records, news stories, images, videos, articles, all related to the primary narrative fitting in your cause. What ultimately happens is that you don't want people to remember the content. You don't care if they remember the specific testimonial or they remember the specific statistic. What you want is that they must imbibe the belief system. The central narrative and the central ideology must become a part of their identity, and that should be something that is a feeling retained within them. So the content should disappear, only the feeling should remain. And that is how the campaign is designed in the end. 2 more parts to it before even starting to work on the ON3C framework, before we decide on building a narrative campaign to influence people. You have to do 2 separate things. One is that you have to define the target. Without knowing which segment of population you are targeting, without knowing which segment of population you want to influence, it's very difficult to design any of it because you don't even understand what will resonate and what will not. That is where something called TAA, target audience analysis, comes in, which is an information warfare technique that Russia actually documented first during the Second World War. That involves creating a dossier of your potential target audience. What do they like? What do they dislike? What increases their anger? What makes them sad? You're creating essentially a profile for your ideal audience. Based on that, you design your creatives, your messaging, your narrative. Everything starts from this. The second part that's actually necessary before engaging with the ON3C framework, you need to build infrastructure to execute the campaign. What does this mean? If you have the most brilliant mind behind your entire narrative building campaign, you have the best context, best creatives. If you have no way to deliver it to the people, it won't matter. If people do not see a message, that message is worthless, no matter how great it is. So before engaging in anything that we discussed in the framework, you need to build a message delivery mechanism. What does this mean? You require Facebook pages with an existing audience. You require YouTube channels with an existing audience. You require some amount of control or reach of TV channels so that they also pick up your message. You require a list of journalists who would be willing to say what you want them to say. You would require a set of influencers who actually support your campaign. So without this pipeline, without this infrastructure, it is almost impossible to execute an information warfare campaign. And what we saw in the Russia-Ukraine war per se, Russia, the messaging was not bad, but their infrastructure to distribute that message got killed off by the United States so early on in the invasion of Ukraine that whatever the Russian side is saying and whatever the Russian side wants people to believe is something that most of the Western world doesn't even know about. If you talk to an average European on, oh, what is Russia's justification for invading Ukraine, they would have no idea, because Russia today, the television network got banned, the social media pages got banned, the bot accounts that they had, a lot of them got taken down. So the campaign just never got started, never got off the ground. But a word of caution here. I attended a very interesting event around information warfare and foreign influence yesterday, and that is where the word of caution comes from. A lot of times these terms are very scary. And when I worked in politics, we started talking about fake news a lot, and a lot of different regulation came in to put in check. Oh, this is going to prevent fake news and that is going to prevent fake news. Right now, information warfare and foreign influence and manipulation is something that has a similar amount of nationalistic fervor attached to it. People get concerned very fast. People get scared very fast of these things. And what happens next? The government moves to regulate. And these regulations, we don't know what will work or what will not from a theoretical standpoint, but regulatory authorities exist to regulate, so they jump in. They take over platforms. As we saw, Twitter got fined 50 lakhs a few days ago by the Karnataka High Court for challenging the government's takedown notice on 39 tweets that they were supposed to take down. So the government has given itself the power to take down any content on any social media platform. It sends you a notice. If you don't take it down, then you get punished, and an official of the social media platform can even get arrested. This has means for manipulation where a government, if it wants, will take down opposition content, will take down content it doesn't like. It might not be misinformation or disinformation. It might just be content that they did not like. That is what Twitter challenged in the Karnataka High Court. The court was like, we're not even going to listen to your case. We're going to put a fine on. Then under the Digital India Act, we have the classification of platforms. Under this, the government will be able to decide what kind of law and what kind of processes to impose on platforms. If they do not comply, they would be liable under these different rules formulated by the government. This also has potential for censorship. This also has potential for a lot of misuse, where if a party wanted, it could control the information flow entirely. We also see government ready to amend rules for OTT platforms. This is platforms like Netflix, Hotstar that has TV shows. The rules are being framed saying they're to curb obscenity, but obscenity and national security, as a lot of us know, are very vaguely defined terms, and takedown notices can have impacts that we haven't even thought of. Fake news led to one set of regulations, and talk of information warfare and foreign actors will lead to a potentially different set of regulations that are problematic for free speech and discourse in a free society, in a democracy. So that is one word of caution that I have come back from yesterday after attending an event, that it's important to keep this in mind. A few lines from the book that we wrote. The struggle has created three distinct camps in the world. You have the Western powers. The Western powers talk of democracy, promote democracy, but they've also propped up authoritarian regimes abroad. But they're still spreading the reality that they are the defenders of democracy. That is their messaging. Then you have Eastern powers led by China and Russia. These are mostly authoritarian regimes at home who promote their vision of domestic societal control as a model to be emulated. So the first powers, US and Europe, basically talk about freedom at home, democracy, liberal values, the state not imposing unjust and unlawful control over its citizenry. The Eastern powers, on the other hand, are like, oh, control all the discourse within your countries that you want. This is what will lead to development. See our development model. We'll also provide you with the tools for domestic societal control. As we see, some of the tools that are implemented in China for the internet censorship regime are also something that are being exported out to Latin American countries right now. And it's essentially a government-to-government deal that brings two countries together. In the middle, we have swing states. These are evolving democracies like India. They are increasingly lured by the power of domestic societal control, as shown by the Eastern powers, China and Russia. But they also want to ally themselves with the Western powers for access to their markets and technologies for economic growth. But they're also internally wary of both. As we see, we failed to condemn Russia when it invaded Ukraine, even though Western powers wanted us to condemn the invasion outright. But on the other side, we also have great relations with the US. We are trying to further defense ties with them, get some technology licenses here. But at the same time, the entire idea of controlling domestic conversation and domestic society that China practices or Russia practices is something that the government also really likes. Because in any democracy, a political party wanting to win elections, the best tool that they can have is to control the domestic conversation entirely. So what this leads to in the information warfare domain is a very similar concept of the splinter net. The splinter net is essentially, right now, for the most part, we have a global internet. Any information that you want, you can see from anywhere in the world. But there is a dilemma between openness and free flow of information on the internet versus controlling and saving your population from a foreign threat, from foreign manipulation, from fake news, from propaganda. So you want to control the internet to prevent all of that. What this creates is splintered internets where every country, every jurisdiction, every domain starts building walls around its own internet. And those walls around the internet ultimately lead to non-free flow of information. And we see right now, China has a different internet from the world's internet. All the apps are different, all the companies are different, all the content is different. You cannot search for, say, the Tiananmen Square massacre on the Chinese internet. You can't search for any term against the regime on the Chinese internet, even though a lot of content on those things exist on the broader internet that we see in the rest of the world. Russia has done something very similar where they've blocked a lot of the content, especially right now after the invasion. What we are seeing now is with takedown notices, with control of social media, a lot of countries are building these blocks. Ultimately, when this spreads, we will have multiple forms of the internet. It wouldn't be a global universal source of information. Coming to mitigation, foreign influence and manipulation, information warfare from even domestic sources is a real threat. So mitigation is definitely something that society needs to look at, society needs to talk about. Internationally, a lot of different bodies are coming together to talk about these issues. What they've come up with right now is disarm framework. What is disarm? This is a framework for sharing data and analysis. It's a pattern, like we discussed ONC 3C framework. It's a framework like that to fit an information warfare campaign into. Right now, what we have is any politician claiming, oh, this is an information warfare attack, this is fake news, this is propaganda. Even say in a country like India, we've alleged a lot of times of foreign interference and foreign information warfare attacks by a country like Pakistan or a country like China. Except because we've not done the rigorous work to collect evidence, we've not done the basic academic diligence required, it's not gone into the record. In the world, there are about 42 instances of marked information warfare attacks. They're all on right now Europe and the US and Australia, because they've done the documentation. They've done the effort to actually prove out the attack instead of the political statement. So disarm framework essentially tells you how to do that. If you think it's an influence operation, if you think it's an information warfare attack, you basically study it in an academically rigorous manner, fit it into a framework, present evidence, and at the very least, get it listed as an attack by a foreign entity on your country's population. So this is happening internationally. It's a free open source framework that anyone's free to contribute to. And ultimately, the idea is once you've identified the methodologies, once you've identified, okay, this is how this state actor conducts information operations, you can preempt them and you can basically see them from the very start. Once you know the methodology, once you know the accounts used, once you know the patterns, you can keep an eye out, you can keep a watchful lens on, okay, this has started again, and you will see what narrative they're trying to promote in the very early days of the operation. And that helps you mitigate the foreign adversaries' actions. Ultimately, though, the real solution, I believe, lies in trusted institutions outside political purview. and an educated, informed, and cohesive society without the fault lines ripe for manipulation. From the US 2016 attacks to the attacks that happened during Brexit and the influence operations that we've actually studied in India itself, what we've noticed is that the foreign adversary uses domestic fault lines. It's so much effort to create new ones that in the US, Russia decided to just target on the Black population because it was already a disenfranchised group. In the context of India, we've seen an influence operation by Iran that we also covered in our book. The Iranian operation was essentially to collect data of the most dissatisfied Muslim youth in India. Iran did nothing to make them dissatisfied. It's the domestic discohesion in society and domestic fault lines, but they were collecting data for use in the future at some point of time. So these fault lines existing within society are what contribute to the threat. And this is what we need to watch for. But obviously creating an informed, educated, cohesive society without fault lines and trusted institutions beyond political purview is a very difficult long-term task. This also requires a just state with incorruptible electoral finances and institutions. The need for incorruptible electoral finances is because a lot of the creation of fault lines has a lot to do with political funding and how untransparent it is. If you knew how politicians are spending their money and where they're getting it from, you would potentially know of any fault line that they're paying to spread in society. Until then, what can be done? One is we really need safeguards on state powers of censorship and any kind of crackdown that might happen. Because preventing fake news is important, preventing foreign influence is extremely important, but without safeguards on state power, it often turns into a method for domestic crackdown. Second, strengthening tracking infrastructure with evidence methodologies and reporting mechanisms. This is very important for a country like India, and that's why I'm glad PPF is organizing this talk, because we need to create the infrastructure to actually track these different IO operations and do it in an academically rigorous manner so that we can get them listed at the international level, at international forums. Right now, there is not a single international influence operation against India that's listed by any international body, that's talked about in any international report. And the reason for that is that we just haven't done the academic work. It's not that the operation itself does not exist. A lot of the operations do. But we need to do the work and create infrastructure for reporting it to the right bodies. Third, obviously, we should be creating an informed society that's inoculated against information operation threats. What this means is that people should be aware of how these things work. People should also be made aware of evidence of when an operation is happening against them. If you provide academically rigorous reports on, okay, this was an influence operation that took place in a country, the population will be more resilient eventually. Problems here, sometimes the foreign information operation aligns with domestic political interests. We've seen this a lot of times. In the US's case, Donald Trump wanted to win the election. All the information operations emanating out of Russia wanted him to win the elections. So what incentive does he have to investigate at that point of time? So that makes it very tricky in a democratic setup, but that is why we need external bodies documenting these cases, even when it supports the incumbent government. This was it from a presentation perspective from my side. Thank you so much. I've also listed my email ID, contact@shivamsingh.in, in case anyone wants to get in touch with me about any of this, especially because it's such an illustrious audience that I would definitely want your feedback on how you see information operations and foreign influence threats should be countered. What should the country be doing? And are we on the right track to counter it? Last thing that I would want to end with, a lot of people in the audience right now have also served in India's institutions, in India's bureaucracy. Regulation creep is something I see as a real challenge because we as academics, as people who study information operations, we are trying to study what stops information operations from having an effect on the domestic population. But the regulations on, oh, take down social media content, oh, arrest anyone that we deem under this law, or let's try to intervene the Telecom Regulatory Authority and create some barriers around messaging. These laws and regulations happen before we even know if any of this is going to work or not from an academic standpoint. So regulations are already happening. What do you think should be the role of civil society? What should be the role of academics in shaping these regulations better before they become a deterrent to free and open elections in a free and open democracy? Is something I would be really interested in learning about. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a very informative and very elaborate session. If I have to sum up the session briefly, you cited the very classical example of Aswatthama, how the fake news was generated to kill Dronacharya, and how it is taking shape in the modern times and the internet age. You also talked about the foreign interference and manipulation, FEMI. You also talked about the how it is different from the engine age, like the internet and age of information. Also, the speed of dissemination of information, the cost is cutting down and the speed is going up. So now we are on the second part of the session, that is question and answer. I would like to request all our participants, if they have any questions, please post it in the question answer chat box. We have a couple of questions in the question and answer box. So this is a question from Manika. She's a researcher in the organization. She asks, can you share any insights on the collaboration between different stakeholders, such as government, private sector organization, and civil society in combating information warfare? How can this collaboration be strengthened?
So yes, definitely. There's a lot of collaboration happening in Europe right now. And Australia is also a major party because they have now seen the impacts on their elections. And it's a proven case of foreign information operation. So they're taking it very seriously. The US also has a lot of collaboration between academic institutions. So universities that have specific chairs dedicated to studying this and the government, and a lot of the think tanks in the US. So a lot of them are studying it. Places like RAND that deal in security have been studying it for years now. Their naval war colleges especially somehow are really big on information warfare. And they've been studying it for decades, and they've been working with think tanks and universities and academics for a really long time. In the Indian context, it is fairly new. Almost no one has done great study on this. So the case of collaboration does not arise yet because neither the government, neither private civil society organizations, neither think tanks, neither universities, almost no one has very solid work on this. Everyone's just starting right now. So my hope from talks like this is also that collaboration will happen. And even within the Indian context, we will start creating rigorous literature around this.
So we have another question from Manika as well. How has information warfare impacted India's relations with neighboring countries? Are there any notable instances of information warfare being employed as a tool of statecraft?
Oh, so there are many. The issue with these is that they remain in the realm of speculation just because, again, the academic work has not happened to conclusively prove it, most of it. But if you look at information warfare in the specific case of India's neighborhood, there was a lot of messaging within a country like Bangladesh, specifically around Muslim atrocities in India. And if you track it, a lot of it was an IO. A very specific example that was also discussed in the DG's conference that happens was around the Muzaffarnagar riots. In the Muzaffarnagar riots, there were a lot of videos that came out of people wearing salwar kameez, indulging in violence. And that led to a backlash from the Hindu community, assuming these are Muslims in Muzaffarnagar killing people. So the Hindu community saw those messages and reacted back out. Those messages were eventually traced as coming out of Pakistan. So this was something that domestic riots within India had a foreign power actually throwing fuel onto the fire. So instances like this have been documented. Within the neighborhood, we see a lot of operations in Nepal right now. And Nepal is contentious because a lot of the Nepali one is not on social media, it's on conventional media. And if you actually study it, a lot of the Nepali newspapers now receive advertisements from Chinese companies, and a lot of them receive advertisements from the Chinese state-run enterprises. So that makes absolutely no sense, because what does, say, a Chinese state-run steel manufacturer have to do with trying to sell steel in Nepal? Because they don't even sell it there, but they're still advertising in 1/3 of the newspapers. So things like this are definitely something that help in shaping the information environment, and it is happening. Sri Lanka is an interesting case, but Sri Lanka is also a case of Indian success, because the information environment in Sri Lanka saw basically information flood in from both sides. So China on one side and India on the other side were both trying to blame the other side for Sri Lanka's economic disaster. The public, for their credit, was busy blaming the domestic population. So neither of the two sides got through very much, and they remained on equal footing.
Thank you, sir. We have another question from one of our participants, Mayur Chaudhary. He says, thank you for such an interesting session. He has two questions. The first one is like FIMI, FME, as you have cited. It would be helpful if you can give example of DIMI and its negative impact. The another question is, it's related to the concept of will splinternet results due geopolitical state compulsion, or will it be a natural outcome of development of internet, says a century later? So we have one more question in this regard. So do you agree that in the name of national security, powerful players are contributing to the building of splinternet?
Okay, perfect. So lots of example of domestic information manipulation. Domestic misinformation, though, is a difficult one, because as soon as you attribute it to a political party, as soon as you attribute it to a certain set of people, certain group of people, it becomes a political issue and it becomes very contentious. So I believe, honestly, studying these threats should be something that should be done without attribution. So you name the specific disinformation and the messaging that was spread, except you don't even try and attribute it to a political party, because at that point it becomes essentially a slugfest and the academic component just drops away. So for domestic misinformation right now, Manipur is seeing a lot of it. If you see a lot of the content within cookie WhatsApp groups and cookie Facebook pages, a lot of it was about church burning, a lot of it was about Meitei attacks. And within the Meitei community, a lot of it was about cookie harassment of Meiteis, cookies killing Meiteis. And a lot of it was not from the current period. A lot of these videos, a lot of these images were actually from 5 years ago, 6 years ago, of isolated incidents that had nothing to do with cookie versus Meitei conflict right now. But these spreading and these going viral on social media made the situation so bad. And the state also chose not to intervene for the most part and let anyone do anything that they wanted. That right now we have a case of internal displacement within India. And it's one of the larger ones in the recent past, where one entire population has had to desert their homes and move to a separate side. So that's one instance. If you look at elections, then a lot of manipulative information comes out from all political parties, all political sides, and even random people, just because they believe in an ideology so much, they end up creating disinformation campaigns. So in this context, a lot of them have happened, and a lot of them have created new fault lines that can be used by the foreign adversary. So at that stage, any messages within DIMI is going to look exactly the same as a FIMI message, except it's going to originate in a foreign country from a foreign bot account. Potentially, the campaign and the message and the content will be exactly the same, as is usually the case in most of the world. The examples that we covered, all of them, the foreign adversary actually used the exact same arguments, just amplified it and had it more targeted because they had more money. Concept related splinternet result due geopolitical state. So it's not a natural outcome of the internet's development that we'll have a splinternet. It's actually something that the states are really pushing for. For the most of history, if you look at the flow of information, the state controlled it. India till the 1990s did not have, say, private television channels even. So it was a state radio broadcaster. It was the state television broadcaster, Doordarshan, basically Prasar Bharati leading the entire thing, where they decided what content will come on air and what content will not come on air. So in that case, state controlled the flow of information for the most part. Newspapers became independent really early on. Print media and printing of books became independent really early on, but distribution and literacy remained limited. So not as many people ever consumed, say, a newspaper as people consume the radio. Even more people started consuming the television. Now we have almost everyone engaging on social media. So these forms have just expanded the reach. Splinternet is resulting from the fact that your population could not be segmented on television. Whoever watches TV watches TV. And there are 10 TV channels. Okay, you might segment it based on that a little, but people are watching television and your message goes to people from different thought processes, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different religions, different castes. On social media, you can segment a population and you can identify a specific believer. US has studied this very well during their election cycle, where specifically if you believe in gun rights or you believe in, oh, abortion is something that is anti-Christian because we hold the right to life sacred. Specifically, those people can be targeted and you find correlations that, okay, if someone believes in abortion, they might also believe in something completely different. Like this person might not believe in climate change as much. And you use these different vectors of attack, connecting them together. That's why Splinternet is happening now, just because of like the structure of the internet. It's not a natural consequence. Social media has a major part to play here because for the longest time, they just did not even consider the possibility of controlling discourse on their platforms. They were pretty happy with collecting ad dollars and getting just the amount of engagement and the amount of viewership that they could get. Now it's going to create a problem for them too. Do you agree that in the name of national security, powerful players are contributing to the building of the Splinternet? Most definitely. A lot of political parties would love it. A lot of private entities would love it. What you see in China, because of the creation of the Splinternet, Chinese firms thrived in every space that is right now dominated by US giants like Facebook, Google, Microsoft. China has equivalents of all of them, and all of them are multi-billion-dollar corporations because these weren't allowed to enter China. So if you have the Splinternet, then domestic players definitely benefit. We will have some sort of a Google equivalent within India, within Pakistan, within Sri Lanka, within every South American country. So the domestic players will benefit.
Thank you, sir. We have another question. It states, the concept of trusted institution looks good. Who will choose this and regulate them?
So yeah, that's actually a great question. The important part here is that institutions have to build trust in themselves. No one is going to choose them. No one says that, oh, this is a trusted institution. The institution works over a number of years and does good enough credible work that people start trusting it. So there was a time when television media was very well trusted. Today, it's not in India. There was a time when WhatsApp forwards were very trusted. So even when like I started out in political campaigning, if someone received a WhatsApp forward in 2015, 2016, they would just read the information and believe it outright. Now, everyone is so aware of fake news. Everyone is so aware of people sending absolute nonsensical things on WhatsApp that people are suspicious, at least if it does not gel with their existing belief system. So trusted institutions right now have kind of disappeared. Institutions will have to come up and build trust in themselves. These might be global players who build trust in some other country and then start spreading abroad and come to India someday. Or it might be Indian domestic institutions that become trusted within a specific niche and then expand their level of trust. But yeah, no one is going to choose these institutions. Regulation is also not going to happen. It's entirely going to be based on credibility.
Thank you, sir. So we have another couple of questions from Apoijam. First question is, how can disarm framework benefit India? Another one is, how can we ensure a cohesive society without fault line while dealing with information operation threats in India?
So disarm benefits India because it's an open source framework. You know their exact methodology on how they want you to study information operations. So you use it, and all the evidence that you have, all the different facts that you've collected, you fit it within the framework. At the end of that, you have a rigorous proof of, okay, this was an information operation. Then you can reach out to international bodies who track information operations and tell them that, okay, this was something that happened in India. List it with everything else. These were the parties responsible as far as we can tell from the framework. And that is why these parties should have some consequences. At the very least, internationally, information operations are not illegal. So you might have domestic laws. Under international law, it is not a war crime. So there is like dropping cluster munition, dropping, say, chemical weapons, dropping bioweapons, dropping nuclear arms. All of these things are against international law. Human rights violations against international law. Information operations, not illegal, completely legal under international law. All you can do right now is create pressure by getting it listed at different international positions. How can you ensure a cohesive society? Very difficult question. A lot of us have explored answers to this. First place to start is to actually implement the law of the land, which says no religion, no caste, no appeal to any of this in politics. This is something that already exists with the Election Commission. It is codified into the laws of India, except implementation is not happening. So it starts there. How do you remove fault lines? A lot of countries have gone through civil wars, and there are processes for trying to build community cohesion and trying to get people together. It usually happens through truth and reconciliation and evidence and acknowledging the wrongs done to each other's community, each other's backgrounds, each other's ethnicities. So you start at that level, but this is a very long-term process. For fighting information operation threats, this is not something that I would bank on. That was the slide after that, which was essentially state safeguards, building people who actually track these operations well, and third, educating people to inoculate them from these operations.
Thank you, sir. We have another question from Nazma Parveen. She says, does this kind of information warfare lead to gerrymandering during the election?
So gerrymandering in India is not as common as the United States, especially because our delimitation commissions happen in very distant times. They don't happen together. And in a lot of ways, it's a very negative thing, as same constituencies remain, say, reserved for scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, even though reservation was supposed to move to different constituencies. So people just build their own strongholds. In the US, if you look at it, gerrymandering has always happened along ethnic lines, happened along the lines of socioeconomic status, segregate poor people from the rich people, so that you could appeal to just one side of the electorate. In that case, information warfare does lead to more votes in a gerrymandered region. We've not observed information warfare itself leading to gerrymandering. It's the other way around. Gerrymandering helps information warfare operations. So if India sometime decided to chalk out constituencies in a manner where one community is the majority, another community is the minority, if we did that, it will make influence warfare operations more effective generally.
Thank you, sir. We have 2-3 questions more. Another one is, as independent nation states are the realities of today with their own legal systems, why is the US controlled internet seen as a blessing and nation states trying to exert sovereign jurisdiction on their information domain consider a threat splinternet? Plus, in the Ukraine war, we see the West has banned Russian news agencies to prevent their news being seen by the domestic population. Are we buying into a US narrative which dominates social media platforms against our own national interest?
So two things here. The internet as it is right now is not US controlled at all. It's the same internet for the entire world. So right now, if you wrote something on Twitter or Facebook, if you wrote a blog post and did SEO rankings, it will list on Google as the same as any article from the United States itself. It's not like your tweet or your Facebook post is not shown to people sitting in the US. Also, the post from people sitting in the US is shown to people in India. People writing in Pakistan, you can view what they're writing about on all of these social media platforms. Splinternet would exist when these nations try and split. Okay, we will not allow foreign content to be shown at all. If someday Pakistan says that, oh, Indian posts and Indian writing, anything on Indian servers, we don't want our people to see it at all. That is the start of a splinternet. So right now, internet isn't US controlled. It's actually US is one of the countries that controls their internet the least. Like they don't censor as much. It's a regime that does not have a sedition law in the books. So they don't exactly arrest people for, oh, you wrote against the country, we are going to arrest you. That does not happen there. So control over content, very less. When it comes to banning the Russian news agency, it was something that the US was able to push through just because of its economic might. So what they've done is India has not banned it. So you can still see Russia today on Tata Sky or Airtel, DTH, or whatever your cable operator you're using. So what the US did was essentially place sanctions on Russia. Then it told economic entities within Russia, within US, who had interest with the US, that, okay, you will not telecast this television channel. You will not promote this content. The commercial entities listen to the US because of its economic power. That is something that we see a lot in each and every country. The only reason Twitter continues to operate and continues to take down content that the Indian government pushes notices against is the financial incentive. They want to remain in India. They want the Indian public on their platform. So they'll listen to whatever the government ends up saying. The US is just this at a much larger scale. Are we buying into a US narrative which dominates social media? I don't know if you're buying into a US narrative, but we are definitely buying into every other country's narrative except, say, China. Because China has its own internet right now. So on a lot of issues, we have absolutely no idea what Chinese people are thinking, what Chinese people are talking about. Like their sentiment towards India is something that we'll get to know through Indian sources and US sources. We will not see Chinese media or like Chinese interviews on Chinese streets about what their population is feeling about Indians. And it honestly might be very positive. We just do not know enough.
Thank you, sir. So we have another question. What about the privacy of our citizens? If we do not localize data, how do we enforce privacy safeguards as per our laws?
So the important question here is, who do we want privacy from? Our laws, as we are crafting them right now, for one, we don't have a data protection law. It's still in the draft. So it's been in the draft stage for a few years now. They've come out with 3 or 4 different drafts of it. Once we have a data protection law, yes, it's a great step in privacy, but we've given all exemptions to the government. So essentially what we are saying right now is your privacy you can keep from me. You'll have data privacy from a corporation, but the government will be able to take everything. At that stage, the question arises, okay, is the government separate enough from political interests? Is the government separate enough from political pressure by particular political parties at all points of time for this to be a legitimate safeguard? If it is not, then you've created privacy of your citizens' data from foreign actors, but you've opened it up for domestic political manipulation. So ultimately, we do need a data protection law. It makes absolute sense, but the law should be strong enough to put safeguards against the government using private citizens' data for political purposes.
I have one question. I'm very curious about the information warfare. So as we see, the technological tools are developing day by day. Now, if we classify the recent information age into 2, that is before the AI, the kind of this information was there, and after the AI tool, which is now accessible through a phone by many hands. How do you see these 2 phases, and how what kind of threat it provides?
So it's a very scary question, and it's a question that a lot of researchers are dealing with right now. The reason it's scary, it's entirely new frontier. A lot of information generation can happen at immense scale now. A spread of information can happen at such scales, and it will be very difficult to detect the difference between human generated content and bot generated content. Even right now, if you look at things like ChatGPT and Google's Bard, it's very difficult to tell that it's written by AI. That's how good it's gotten. So now a lot of the threat is going to be algorithmically pushed. Till now, we had like bot farms with people sitting there. India was a major party in foreign influence. Philippines was a major party because we had cheap labor. So even foreign entities have hired entire call centers and firms in India to do this at a global level, not for a government, for like private political parties in different countries around the world. Now it can happen at such scale that it's scary. The safeguards to protect against that do not exist right now. The other part of this is algorithmic security is such a complicated subject. What will get amplified and what will not get amplified will make all the difference. And algorithms have their own rules. They're making their own laws in a way. And how you regulate that, how you put a check on that is something that people are still dealing with. So very relevant question, but all we can say is it's going to get worse.
Thank you very much, sir. So we have another question from Ms. Pooja. She asks, how can common people understand things on social media? Because many times these platforms are made themselves available to misuse things and there is no control on them. Again, name of the national security, freedom of expression, etc.
So the part here is that social media content that comes on, if it is organic, if people are generating it, then censorship regime is in general a bad idea, because what that eventually leads to is an authoritarian state where one ruling dispensation will end up controlling any discourse happening in the country. If you can track down that it's a coordinated campaign and a coordinated attack by a malicious actor, then there have to be some capabilities of social media censoring it in some way, taking down content, not letting the algorithm make it go viral. These are safeguards that social media companies will have to build in. Common people do not have to understand content on social media itself. They have to understand what good content is. So they have to understand what the scientific temper is, something that's also in our constitution as a directive principle. They have to understand what evidence means. They have to understand what research means. And they have to then understand that not all content that they get is going to be true. So once people have developed a scientific temper, and once people have started understanding the value of inquiry, the value of questioning, and questioning not just India as a society culturally is a very non-questioning society. We don't question authority. And this comes from our childhood too, because oh, bado ki baat manni chahiye. Always listen to your elders, always listen to authority. So that is something very ingrained. And the questioning scientific attitude is something that we will have to work towards, not just because of misinformation threats, but also because that's what leads to a good society, a positive, constructive society in the end.
Thank you, sir. So we have KM Singh sir with us. KM Singh sir, would you like to raise a question or share your comments? KM Singh sir?
I see Sanjay Sinha ji has joined in, so we can put on. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
No, I have no question to ask. I would only like to compliment Shivam for a brilliant presentation on a subject which is very complex, but making it so simple for everyone to understand. Thank you, Shivam. Brilliant talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Pleasure.
Okay, Prince, then we can wind up.
Sir, thank you, sir.
I think Sanjay Sinha ji has a question.
Sir, Sanjay sir has a question, I guess. Sanjay sir, you may please ask your question.
He's just dropped on offline, I think.
Sanjay sir, you may please raise your question.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'd like to thank Mr. Shivam Shankar Singh for a very brilliant and comprehensive presentation on a difficult subject. The potential impact of information warfare on influencing the public opinion worldwide. India would obviously be no exception. Such exercises must have been carried out in the, I'm particularly interested in the elections in the previous elections. What is your assessment of its misuse in the 2024 elections? And what would be your prescription, if any, to insulate the electorate to the maximum from false narratives?
So definitely great potential for misuse, and potentially propaganda is a tool that is used to convince people, and it's a very legitimate tool because there is no other way to get people to support you unless you frame a narrative. So every political party is going to do it. The problem arises when it's divisive in nature and it's creating fault lines in society. So that is something that we definitely have to watch out for, because foreign influence and manipulation often uses these domestic fault lines for its own agenda. So two things need to happen. One, we need to be very stringent about following the electoral code of conduct, where the election commission really says that, okay, divisive things will not be allowed. Social media companies need to understand their responsibility in this and essentially fast track processes during the election. But more importantly, we need setups together to actually track foreign interference, because right now our capability to do so is quite limited. So once we have a certain amount of setups built in who track at least like the foreign aspect of it, who track foreign misinformation, all we can do at that point of time is educate the public that, okay, domestic fault lines are being created to win elections, and a foreign adversary is using the same fault line for its own interests and against the interests of India. Once that is clear to the public, I believe a lot of people would be hesitant to spread divisive content.
The Election Commission has lost its credibility to some extent. It has, I have a feeling that it will have to reinvent itself.
So a lot of the prescriptions rely on institutions functioning, sadly, and institutions not functioning at that point of time, that is where the fear comes in. Any law that you bring in would be used for domestic political crackdowns and against anyone who's against you. That concern comes in because of the institutional weakness. Solutions to that I don't have right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I think we have one last question, and it says, the internet is controlled by the US via ICANN, who controls the DNS root zone servers. Do you think it should be under the UN and ITU?
So the ICANN itself is an international consortium. So it's not controlled by the US per se. The other part of it is that the US, even if it say controlled the internet, has not displayed any attempt to control it right now. Say the physical infrastructure, it could potentially cut off your fiber optic cable. They've not done it yet. So I haven't as of now seen a single piece of evidence which say the internet is US controlled in any way, especially US government controlled. It is controlled by US corporations in a lot of way, because the corporations run the major social media platforms. That is where you are getting content from. They have their own moderation policies. They decide what goes viral. So if you blamed it on the social media companies which are in the US, maybe there is still some legitimacy to it, but the government has really, like through ICANN or DNS, they've never tried to shut down the internet for any country as of right now. In fact, India is the country that shuts down internet domestically most often. So should we allow states to build their own infrastructure, people then to build their own infrastructure so that the government of India can't cut it off?
Thank you very much, sir. I think with that question, we came to the end of the session. I would once again like to thank you very much for your very informative and elaborative session, and also addressing all the questions very patiently. I would also like to thank all our participants and viewers for bearing with us. I hope the session was very informative for everyone, and thank you very much. We hope to meet once again very soon on the next episode of DAREECHA. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Thank you, sir.